In 2018, Jessica Simmons was a 34-year-old seasoned police officer working in the Phoenix Police Department. After serving over a decade on the force, she had developed a reputation for being methodical, dedicated, and highly reliable in critical situations. That year, she was assigned a new partner, Laura Mitchell, a bright and energetic officer a few years younger than Jessica. Laura had only been with the department for 5 years but was already making a name for herself. Their pairing seemed promising, as both officers shared a strong sense of duty and professionalism. In October of that year, Laura invited Jessica to a casual dinner at her home. Laura had recently moved in with her husband, Nick Mitchell, a 35-year-old IT specialist who worked for a local cybersecurity firm. Laura often spoke about Nick at work, mentioning how supportive he was of her career and how they had built a solid relationship over the 7 years of their marriage. Jessica, who lived alone, appreciated the opportunity to connect with her partner outside of work and accepted the invitation without hesitation. The dinner took place in a modest but cozy suburban home in Scottsdale, Arizona, where Laura and Nick lived. The evening started off uneventfully, with casual conversation about work, hobbies, and some of the more amusing cases they had handled recently. It was the kind of light-hearted atmosphere Jessica had anticipated. However, when Nick joined the dinner, something shifted. Jessica hadn't expected much from meeting Laura's husband. Her focus had always been strictly on work, and personal relationships were rarely a priority for her. But when she and Nick were introduced, an undeniable connection formed immediately. Nick was friendly and approachable, with a calm demeanor that contrasted with Laura's more energetic personality. His deep voice and calm confidence caught Jessica off guard. As the evening progressed, she found herself subtly drawn to him in a way that made her uncomfortable. She noticed his quick wit, his attentive listening, and the way his eyes occasionally lingered on her during their conversations. Nick, for his part, also seemed to feel the pull between them, though he remained loyal to Laura and never crossed any boundaries. His demeanor toward Jessica grew warmer with each visit. He often seemed more engaged in conversations with her than with anyone else, and Jessica noticed subtle signs that indicated he was aware of the tension between them. Sometimes when Laura left the room, the silence between Jessica and Nick would grow heavy, as if both were struggling with unspoken thoughts. By the end of the year, Jessica found herself in a difficult position. She was falling for Nick, despite knowing that he was married to her partner and friend. The guilt gnawed at her, but she couldn't stop herself from seeking him out. Each interaction with Nick left her both exhilarated and conflicted, torn between her desire and her moral compass. Jessica justified her actions by telling herself that it was harmless, that no one was being hurt, and that it was only a matter of time before her feelings would fade. By early 2019, Jessica and Nick found themselves spending more time together, not just socially but through work-related circumstances. Laura, as Jessica's partner, was often busy with administrative duties or managing other cases, leaving Jessica to handle specific assignments on her own. As luck or fate would have it, Nick's expertise in cybersecurity came in handy during a few investigations that required technical support. This provided Jessica with a legitimate reason to reach out to Nick directly, outside of Laura's presence. The first joint investigation happened in February 2019, when a local bank reported a series of cyber attacks attempting to breach their security systems. Laura was tied up in another case, so Jessica was assigned to take the lead. Given the complexity of the cybercrime, she knew they would need specialized assistance. Jessica immediately thought of Nick. She contacted him, explaining the situation and requesting his help in consulting on the case. Nick agreed without hesitation, eager to assist. Their work together started off strictly professional. Jessica appreciated Nick's efficiency and expertise, while Nick respected Jessica's sharp investigative instincts. However, as they spent hours going over data and piecing together leads, the underlying tension between them resurfaced. It wasn't long before their conversations drifted away from work and became more personal. Jessica found herself enjoying these moments more than she should have, feeling a connection that went beyond their work or friendship with Laura. By March, their friendship had deepened into something more complicated. They began sharing details about their personal lives that neither had discussed before. Nick confided in Jessica about his frustrations at work, the stress of managing a team, and the long hours that were putting a strain on his marriage. Jessica listened intently, feeling a mix of empathy and guilt. She sympathized with Nick, knowing that his marriage wasn't as perfect as it seemed on the surface. As they grew closer, Jessica's guilt began to weigh heavily on her. She was fully aware that she was betraying Laura, not through actions, but through intentions. Each day she told herself that she needed to pull back, to distance herself from Nick before things escalated. But every time she saw him, her resolve crumbled. The connection they shared was too strong, and resisting it felt impossible. Nick, for his part, was equally torn. He had always been loyal to Laura, and he never imagined he would feel this way about anyone else. But Jessica was different. She understood him in a way that Laura didn't, and their shared work experience created a bond that felt natural and easy. Nick found himself thinking about Jessica more and more, wondering what might have been if they had met under different circumstances. In the following months, Jessica and Nick continued to work together on various cases. Each time they collaborated, the tension between them grew stronger. They no longer needed excuses to see each other. Work provided them with ample opportunities to meet. Their conversations became more personal, their silences more charged with unspoken desire. It was as if they were both waiting for the other to make the first move, but neither was willing to cross that line, at least not yet. In April, their partnership on a particularly complex case brought them closer than ever. They spent long hours together, often working late into the night to piece together evidence. During one of these late-night sessions, as they sat in the dimly lit office poring over files, the air between them became thick with tension. Jessica could feel the unspoken emotions hanging in the space between them, and she knew Nick felt it too. There was a moment when their eyes met, and for a split second, she thought he might say something, acknowledge what they both knew was happening. As the months dragged on, the emotional strain began to take its toll on Jessica. She found it harder and harder to concentrate on her work, her thoughts constantly drifting back to Nick. The guilt was overwhelming, but so was the desire. She was caught in a web of her own making, unable to break free from the feelings that were consuming her. Nick, too, was struggling. His marriage to Laura was starting to feel like a burden, a commitment that no longer brought him the happiness it once did. He couldn't deny that his connection with Jessica was stronger than anything he had felt in years, but the thought of hurting Laura, of betraying her trust, held him back from acting on those feelings. Though neither Jessica nor Nick had taken any concrete steps to act on their feelings, the emotional affair between them was undeniable. The fall of 2019, Jessica found herself increasingly consumed by her feelings for Nick. What had started as an innocent friendship had evolved into something much deeper, and now she could no longer deny it. Every time she saw Nick and Laura together, the sight filled her with a gnawing sense of jealousy. It wasn't just that she wanted to be close to Nick, it was that Laura was in the way, the one person standing between her and the life she imagined for herself. Watching Nick with Laura became almost unbearable. Laura was completely unaware of the tension brewing beneath the surface, which made it even worse for Jessica. Every time she saw them together, laughing or sharing a private moment, it felt like a knife twisting in her chest. She couldn't help but compare herself to Laura, finding every reason to believe that she would make Nick happier than Laura ever could. The jealousy festered inside her, growing stronger with each passing day. Jessica's jealousy was not just about wanting to be with Nick, it was also fueled by a deep sense of injustice. She felt that she and Nick shared something special, something that Laura could never understand. The more time she spent around them, the more convinced she became that Nick was trapped in a marriage that no longer served him. Jessica believed that if it weren't for Laura, she and Nick could be truly happy together. In her mind, Laura was the only obstacle standing in the way of their happiness. This jealousy soon gave way to darker thoughts. Jessica began to obsess over Laura, scrutinizing her every move, every word, every interaction with Nick. She started to see Laura not just as her partner at work, but as a rival, someone she needed to outmaneuver. The idea that Laura was somehow less deserving of Nick than she was took root in her mind. Jessica started to believe that Laura's presence in Nick's life was an injustice, and that removing her would be the only way to set things right. At first, these thoughts were fleeting, passing through Jessica's mind in moments of weakness. But as the days went on, they became more persistent. She would lie awake at night replaying interactions between Nick and Laura in her head, thinking about what might happen if Laura weren't around. These thoughts frightened her at first. She had never considered herself capable of such things, but the more she thought about it, the more the idea began to make sense. Jessica began to imagine what her life would be like without Laura in the picture. She envisioned herself and Nick together, free from the constraints of his marriage. They could be happy, truly happy, without the constant reminder of Laura standing between them. In Jessica's mind, it seemed like the most logical solution. If Laura were gone, everything would fall into place. Despite these growing thoughts, Jessica wasn't ready to take action yet. She knew that what she was considering was dangerous not just for Laura, but for herself as well. She was an experienced police officer, fully aware of the risks involved in even entertaining such ideas. The rational part of her mind told her to let it go, to walk away before things escalated further. But the emotional part of her, the part that was in love with Nick, couldn't let go. As Jessica's jealousy deepened, so did her resentment toward Laura. Every time they worked together, every time she saw Laura with Nick, the anger simmered just below the surface. Jessica became increasingly short-tempered, snapping at Laura over minor issues during their shifts. She hated the fact that Laura seemed oblivious to what was happening between her and Nick, as if their connection meant nothing. The resentment only fueled her desire to eliminate Laura from the equation. Though Jessica had not yet formulated a concrete plan, the idea of getting rid of Laura began to take up more and more space in her mind. She started to see opportunities where she hadn't before, moments when Laura was vulnerable, times when something could go wrong. Jessica's training as a police officer gave her the knowledge and skills to commit the perfect crime, and she couldn't help but think about how easy it might be to make Laura's death look like an accident. These thoughts terrified Jessica at first, but over time she became more comfortable with them. She rationalized that she wasn't really planning to harm Laura, she was just exploring possibilities, thinking through scenarios. But deep down, Jessica knew that if the right opportunity presented itself, she might not be able to resist. The jealousy had taken over, clouding her judgment and pushing her toward a path she had never thought she would consider. By late 2019, Jessica's thoughts about Laura's removal had become more than just fleeting fantasies. As she began to seriously contemplate what it would take to get rid of Laura without raising suspicion. She thought about Laura's habits, her routines, the dangerous situations they sometimes found themselves in as police officers. It wouldn't be difficult, Jessica realized, to make it look like Laura had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. By early 2020, Jessica's thoughts about removing Laura had grown from fleeting fantasies into a calculated plan. She spent months observing Laura, learning her habits and identifying the perfect opportunity for an accident. As a seasoned police officer, Jessica knew how investigations worked and was determined to craft a scenario that would be nearly impossible to trace back to her. The key was timing. Jessica knew that a high-risk situation would provide the perfect cover for something to go wrong. In March 2020, they received a call about an armed robbery, exactly the kind of scenario Jessica had been waiting for. The chaos of a shootout would give her the chance to act. She planned to make it look like Laura was caught in the crossfire. It would require precision, but Jessica was confident she could pull it off. In the days leading up to the robbery, Jessica distanced herself from Laura, keeping their interaction strictly professional. She couldn't afford any slip-ups. She had spent too long preparing for this moment, and now all the pieces were falling into place. The night before the robbery, Jessica lay awake, going over her plan one last time. She knew the layout of the store, the likely behavior of the suspect, and every potential outcome. She had rehearsed the sequence of events in her head so many times that it felt like second nature. Now all she had to do was execute. On the day of the assignment, Jessica arrived at the precinct, calm and composed. She greeted Laura as usual, though a strange detachment lingered. As they moved into position at the robbery, Jessica's heart raced. The suspect was armed, and the tension was palpable. Jessica stayed close behind Laura, waiting for the right moment. In the chaos of the shootout, she knew she could make her move without anyone noticing. It would all be over in seconds. As the suspect raised his weapon, Jessica saw her chance. She took a deep breath, her hand hovering over her gun, ready to act. On March 15, 2020, Jessica and Laura were dispatched to a convenience store in Dayton, Ohio, responding to a call about an armed robbery in progress. The store was located in a quiet suburban neighborhood not far from the police station, but the situation was far from ordinary. The suspect was reported to be armed and had taken a store clerk hostage, demanding money from the register. The atmosphere was tense as Jessica and Laura approached the scene, knowing that any misstep could turn deadly. Jessica, who had meticulously planned this moment, felt her heart race not with fear, but with anticipation. She had rehearsed every possible scenario in her mind, and now it was time to put her plan into action. The store had a narrow layout with rows of shelves blocking visibility from the entrance. The suspect had positioned himself behind the counter, partially obscured by the shelves. Jessica and Laura crouched low, taking cover as they assessed the situation. Laura, as the senior officer on the scene, took charge. She instructed Jessica to follow her lead, and together they moved toward the entrance of the store. Laura shouted commands for the suspect to drop his weapon and surrender. The suspect, a man in his late 20s, appeared agitated, his gun still pointed at the clerk. He was sweating, clearly panicked and ready to act recklessly. Jessica stayed just behind Laura, her eyes scanning the room but always returning to Laura's back. She had waited for this moment, and now it was finally within her grasp. The chaos of the robbery, the tension, and the danger provided the perfect cover for her to act. Laura was completely focused on the suspect, her attention fixed on de-escalating the situation, unaware of the danger looming behind her. As the suspect raised his gun toward them, Laura moved forward slightly, stepping into the line of fire. It was in that exact moment that Jessica saw her opportunity. Her breath caught in her throat as she made her move. With cold precision, she aimed her gun directly at Laura's back and pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot echoed in the small store, deafening in the enclosed space. Laura staggered forward, her body jolting as the bullet struck her. In the span of a second, Jessica shifted her position and fired toward the suspect. The suspect, who had been distracted by the officers, didn't notice Jessica's maneuver. Her shot hit the shelves near him, but the chaos of the moment made it seem like the gunfire had come from the suspect's weapon. Panicked, the suspect fired back in Jessica's direction, his shots erratic and wild, further supporting her version of events. The gunfight was over as quickly as it had started. Laura collapsed to the ground, blood pooling beneath her. Jessica quickly radioed for backup, her voice steady despite the rush of adrenaline coursing through her veins. Officer down, shots fired, suspect is armed. Her words were urgent, designed to convey the seriousness of the situation without revealing her true involvement. As other officers arrived on the scene, Jessica knelt beside Laura, pressing her hands against the wound as if trying to stop the bleeding. It was a futile effort. Laura was already slipping away. In those few moments, Jessica played her role to perfection. She was the concerned partner, trying desperately to save her colleague, her face contorted with a mix of fear and grief. She kept her hands on Laura's wound, though inside she knew there was no saving her. Laura's breaths grew shallow, and within minutes she was gone. Paramedics arrived shortly after, but by then, it was too late. They confirmed what Jessica already knew: Laura was dead. As investigators combed the scene for evidence, Jessica stood apart from the others, her face a mask of sorrow. In her mind, she replayed the moment over and over: the shot, the fall, the aftermath. She had pulled the trigger, ended Laura's life, and yet no one would ever know. The guilt that had gnawed at her for weeks was now replaced by a strange numbness. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back. Despite the horror of the situation, Jessica found herself feeling an odd sense of relief. Laura was gone, and now nothing stood in the way of her and Nick. It was a twisted justification, but in Jessica's mind, it made sense. She had done what she had to do to secure her future, to eliminate the obstacle that stood between her and the life she wanted. The official report, filed later that night, detailed the events as a tragic accident. According to the report, Laura had been shot by the suspect during the exchange of gunfire, and despite Jessica's efforts to save her, she had died from her injuries at the scene. Suspect's weapon was found to have discharged during the altercation, further corroborating Jessica's story. It was an open and shut case. As Jessica drove home that night, the weight of what she had done began to settle in. She had taken a life not in the heat of battle or in self-defense, but out of cold, calculated desire. She had orchestrated the death of her partner, someone she had worked with, someone who had trusted her. But in her mind, it was all worth it. Laura was gone, and now she could move forward closer to Nick and closer to the life she had envisioned. After Laura's death, Jessica and Nick grew closer, bound by shared grief and the trauma of losing someone so dear. In the days following the funeral, Nick leaned heavily on Jessica for support. To the outside world, it seemed like a natural progression, two people connected by the same tragedy finding solace in each other. Jessica, however, felt a deeper, darker satisfaction. Her plan had worked perfectly, and now she was in Nick's life as the person who could understand his pain. But despite this, a sense of unease gnawed at her. Unbeknownst to Jessica, there were already whispers within the department. Some of the investigators found inconsistencies in the ballistics report. The angle of the bullet that killed Laura didn't quite match up with the position of the suspect during the shootout. At first, this was dismissed as a minor discrepancy, but as more forensic evidence came in, it became harder to ignore. Investigators also found Jessica's behavior following the shooting odd. While her grief seemed genuine, there were subtle moments where she appeared too composed, too calculated for someone who had just lost a partner. The turning point came when the department obtained surveillance footage from a nearby store. The camera didn't capture the actual shooting inside the convenience store, but it did record the moments just before and after. Investigators noticed that Jessica's positioning didn't match her initial statement. She had claimed to have been directly behind Laura, firing at the suspect as he shot Laura, but the footage showed her taking a different approach. Her movement seemed deliberate, almost as if she was positioning herself for something. On April 10, 2020, nearly a month after Laura's death, Jessica was called into the police station under the pretense of a routine follow-up interview. When she arrived, she was met by two detectives from the Internal Affairs Division. They asked her to go over the events of the shooting once again, probing deeper into the details. This time, Jessica felt the tension in the room, but she remained calm, sticking to her original story. It wasn't until they presented the surveillance footage and pointed out the discrepancies that her calm began to slip. The detectives then revealed the ballistics report, showing how the bullet that killed Laura didn't match the trajectory from the suspect's gun. It was at this point that Jessica knew she had made a fatal error. She had overlooked the one detail that would bring everything crashing down the forensic evidence. In a matter of hours, her world began to unravel. The investigators had enough to place her under arrest, charging her with the murder of her partner. The trial that followed was brutal. The prosecution laid out every detail of Jessica's plan, from the moment she decided to kill Laura to the execution of the murder during the robbery. They presented the forensic evidence, the surveillance footage, and testimony from other officers who had begun to suspect her. The jury listened in shock as the case unfolded. Jessica, once a respected officer, was now exposed as a manipulative murderer. For Nick, the trial was a nightmare. He had lost his wife, and now he had to confront the reality that the woman he had grown close to, the woman who had been there for him in his grief, was the one responsible for Laura's death. The betrayal cut deeper than he could have imagined. He sat through every day of the trial, his eyes vacant, unable to comprehend how everything had fallen apart so completely. On May 24, 2021, the jury returned a guilty verdict. Jessica was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As she was led away, she caught one last glimpse of Nick. He didn't say a word, didn't look her in the eye. For him, there was nothing left to say. His life had been destroyed by the very person he had come to trust. In that moment, Jessica realized the full weight of her actions. She had not only killed Laura, but she had also lost any chance at the life she had wanted with Nick. Jessica would spend the rest of her life behind bars, haunted by the consequences of her choices. Nick, meanwhile, was left alone, shattered by the betrayal and the loss of the two most important people in his life.